Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The cicadas were singing their little hearts out, a nightly symphony I'd come to associate with late summer in our quiet corner of North Carolina. That particular evening, the air was thick and sweet with the smell of honeysuckle from the vine that had ambitions of taking over my back fence, the one I shared with Arthur. Arthur Jenkins, my neighbor for the past 15 years, ever since I'd bought this little clapboard house after my divorce from Michael. He was a man of routine, Arthur was, predictable as the sunrise, and in many ways just as comforting. 60-something, a retired history professor, quiet, kept to himself mostly, but always with a polite nod or a gentle wave if he saw me puttering in my garden or wrestling with the recycling bins. I, Sarah, was 52 myself, a librarian at the county library, a life perhaps as quiet as Arthur's, filled with the rustle of pages and the hushed whispers of patrons. My days were ordered, my evenings usually spent with a book and a cup of herbal tea. Excitement was a new shipment of large print novels or a particularly lively book club discussion. So you can imagine, my life wasn't exactly a roller coaster of unforeseen events. That evening, though, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the stars seemed to hang a little lower in the sky, brighter than usual, as if someone had polished them just for us. I'd been out on my small patio, nursing a glass of iced tea, trying to catch a bit of a breeze. The heat had been relentless all week. Arthur was out too, sitting on his own patio, a mirror image of mine, separated by that ambitious honeysuckle and about 20 feet of neatly trimmed grass. He wasn't reading, which was unusual. He just sat there, silhouetted against the faint glow coming from his kitchen window, looking up at the sky. We hadn't spoken much that day, just the usual "Morning, Arthur," "Morning, Sarah," over the fence while I was watering my struggling tomato plants. He'd offered some advice about blight, his voice a soft baritone that always seemed to carry a hint of sadness, or perhaps just weariness. I'd thanked him, made a mental note to actually try his organic solution, and we'd retreated into our respective solitudes. But tonight, the silence between us felt different. Less like the comfortable quiet of neighbors who respected each other's space, and more like a held breath. I found myself watching him more than the stars. He had a way of being still that was almost meditative. After a while, I almost went inside, thinking I shouldn't intrude on his reverie, but then he shifted, his chair scraping softly on the concrete. "Sarah?" he called out, his voice quiet but clear in the still night air. "Yes, Arthur?" I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Those stars, aren't they something tonight?" "They really are," I agreed, like diamonds scattered on velvet. I cringed inwardly a little. So cliché, but he didn't seem to mind. "Indeed," he murmured. Another stretch of silence then. "Would you mind some company? Or rather, would you mind if I had some?" This was new. Arthur rarely initiated social contact beyond pleasantries. We'd shared a cup of coffee on my porch maybe twice in 15 years, usually after some minor neighborhood crisis like a fallen tree or a power outage. "Not at all, Arthur," I said, genuinely surprised but also a little pleased. "Come on over, if you like. I think I have another glass for some iced tea somewhere." He rose slowly, a tall, slightly stooped figure. As he walked around the end of the fence, rather than through the gap we'd long ago stopped bothering to fix, I noticed he was carrying a small, rather battered-looking wooden box. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a shoebox, but it seemed to have a certain weight, a presence in his hands. He settled into the wicker chair opposite me, the one Michael used to favor. The thought flickered past, as it sometimes did, a dull ache rather than a sharp pain anymore. Arthur placed the box carefully on the small table between us. "Thank you, Sarah. he said. It's a night for sharing, perhaps." "Sharing what, Arthur?" I asked gently, pouring him a glass of tea. The ice cubes clinked, a small, cheerful sound in the otherwise hushed atmosphere. He didn't answer immediately. He wrapped his long, bony fingers around the glass, his gaze distant, fixed on something beyond my garden, beyond the night itself. The crickets chirped on, oblivious. The scent of honeysuckle was almost intoxicating. I waited, a sense of anticipation building within me, mixed with a strange sort of apprehension. It was the box, I think. It seemed to hum with unspoken stories. Finally he looked at me, his eyes, usually a soft, faded blue, seemed darker, more intense in the dim light from my kitchen window. "I have something to tell you, Sarah," he began, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "Something I've never told another living soul." My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the moment the evening had been leading up to. The ordinary was about to peel back, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what lay beneath. He paused, took a slow sip of his tea, then placed his hand on the lid of the wooden box. "It concerns this," he said, tapping the polished, though aged, wood, "and a life I almost lived." I leaned forward, my own tea forgotten, my heart thumping a little harder than usual. The night air, which had felt so thick and heavy moments before, now seemed charged, electric. What could Arthur, my quiet, predictable neighbor, possibly have to confess that would warrant such a preamble, such a heavy sense of occasion? I had a feeling my perception of the man I thought I knew was about to be irrevocably altered, there under the vast, silent canopy of stars. And a little part of me, the part that had grown tired of purely predictable days, was strangely eager for it. The other part, the part that cherished peace and order, felt a tremor of unease. I looked at his face, earnest and shadowed, and then at the box, a silent keeper of secrets. I simply nodded, a signal for him to continue, to unlock whatever lay within. Arthur traced the grain of the wood on the box with a fingertip. "My wife, Eleanor, she knew a part of it, but not all. No one knows all of it." He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "We all have paths not taken, don't we, Sarah? Roads we chose not to travel for one reason or another." I nodded slowly. "I suppose we do. I've certainly got a few of those filed away." I thought of my own youthful dreams, the art degree I'd started but never finished, the year I'd planned to spend backpacking through Europe that had turned into a down payment on a sensible car. Life had a way of rerouting you, often without you even noticing until you looked back. "This," he said, his voice gaining a little strength, "this was more than just a path not taken. It was a different life entirely. A life I was offered, a life I even stepped into for a brief, shining moment." He looked directly at me then, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes I'd never seen before, a stark, raw honesty that made me sit up straighter. It was a long time ago. Before Eleanor, before my academic career, before I became the Arthur Jenkins you know. The way he said, "the Arthur Jenkins you know," sent a little shiver down my spine. It was as if he was talking about a character he played, a role he had inhabited for decades. Who was the Arthur Jenkins I didn't know? The silence stretched again, but this time it was filled with a palpable tension, the kind that precedes a revelation. The cicadas seemed to have momentarily paused their chorus, as if they too were waiting. He took another deep breath, his gaze dropping back to the box. "It started when I was a young man, just out of college, full of ideals, a bit of a dreamer, I suppose. Not much like the pragmatic old historian I became." A faint, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "I had a passion, Sarah. a real, burning passion that had nothing to do with dusty books and ancient civilizations. I waited, giving him the space to gather his thoughts, to unearth these long-buried memories. The porch light cast soft shadows on his face, highlighting the lines etched by time, lines that suddenly seemed to hint at a far more dramatic history than I could ever have imagined. He wasn't just my quiet, elderly neighbor anymore. He was a man with a hidden chapter, a story that was about to unfold under the summer stars, and I was, for some reason he had chosen, to be its sole audience. The weight of that, the unexpected intimacy of it, began to settle over me. It felt significant. He finally lifted the lid of the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, lay a harmonica. Not a cheap, toy store kind, but a beautiful, gleaming chromatic harmonica, its silver finish catching the faint light. Beside it, there were a few carefully folded, yellowed newspaper clippings and a small, dog-eared photograph of a much younger Arthur, his hair dark and swept back, a confident, almost roguish grin on his face. He was standing on a stage, a microphone before him, that very same harmonica clutched in his hand. He looked alive, vibrantly, astonishingly alive. My eyes widened. Arthur. My Arthur Jenkins, the reserved academic, a stage performer? It was so far removed from the man I saw tending his roses or meticulously sorting his mail. "I was a musician, Sarah," he said softly, his voice tinged with a complex mix of pride and sorrow. Or at least I was trying to be. A blues harmonica player, to be precise. They called me Artie J. He picked up the harmonica, handling it with a reverence that spoke volumes. This was my voice, back then, my way of speaking to the world. He looked at me, perhaps gauging my reaction. I was speechless, trying to reconcile the image in the photograph with the man sitting before me. The energy, the sheer youthful exuberance in that picture, it was like looking at a completely different person. Artie J. It sounded like a name from a bygone era, a smoky club, a mournful, soulful tune played late into the night. "I played, Sarah," he continued, his gaze now far away, lost in the echoes of the past. "I played in little clubs, smoky bars, anywhere they'd let me. From Chicago down to New Orleans. For a couple of years, that was my life. Hand to mouth, sometimes sleeping in my car, but I was doing what I loved. I felt like I was truly myself." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. The crickets had resumed their song, a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the sudden turbulence of Arthur's revealed past. I looked at the photograph again, at the young man with the world at his feet, his future an unwritten song. And then I looked at Arthur, his shoulders stooped, his face etched with the quiet resignation of years. "What happened, Arthur?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to Artie J?" He sighed, a long, slow exhalation that seemed to drain some of the light from his eyes. He placed the harmonica gently back in its velvet nest. "Life happened, Sarah," he said, a touch of bitterness creeping into his tone. "Or perhaps I allowed it to happen. Choices were made. Responsibilities, perceived or real, took precedence. He told me about a girl, not Eleanor, but someone from that wandering, musical life. A fiery singer with a voice like rough honey. They'd been a duo on and off stage. There was love there, a wild, untamed kind of love that burned bright and fast. He spoke of dreams they'd shared, of cutting a record, of maybe, just maybe, making it big. The way he described her, her passion, her talent, her unwavering belief in him, it was clear she had been a significant force in his life, a muse. Then came the crossroads. An opportunity arose, a chance to tour with a more established blues band, a real break. But at the same time, his father fell ill back home. A serious illness, one that required someone to take over the family's small hardware business, a business Arthur had never had any interest in but felt a deep filial duty towards. His father was a stern man, old-fashioned, who had always disapproved of Arthur's frivolous musical pursuits. He'd called it a hobby, not a life. "I was torn, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Torn in a way I can't quite describe. On one hand, there was this dream, this vibrant life that felt like my very essence. And on the other, duty, responsibility, the weight of expectation." He looked down at his hands, clenching and unclenching them as if reliving the agony of that decision. She, the singer, her name was Leela. She urged me to go for the tour. She said my father would understand, or if he didn't, it was his problem. She said I owed it to my talent. She said, he trailed off, his voice cracking slightly. She said if I didn't go, if I chose duty over my dream, a part of me would die. And she wasn't sure she could love a man who was only half alive. The air on the patio felt heavy, charged with the weight of that decades-old dilemma. I could almost see him, the young RDJ, standing at that fork in the road, the music pulling him one way, the heavy hand of family obligation pulling him another. It was a classic, tragic choice. "So, what did you do?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer, given the man he had become. He looked up, and there were unshed tears glistening in his eyes. "I came home, Sarah. I chose my father. Chose the hardware store. I told myself it was temporary, just until he recovered. But he never fully did, and 1 year turned into 2, then 5. The store, it consumed me, or rather, I let it. The music, RDJ, Lila, they faded, like a photograph left out in the sun." He explained how Lila had waited for a while, writing letters filled with encouragement, then frustration, then a sad resignation. Eventually, the letters stopped. He heard much later, through a mutual acquaintance, that she'd found a new musical partner, and then, eventually, a new life partner. He never saw her again. "I buried RDJ deep," Arthur said, his voice raspy. "I went back to school, got my degrees, became Professor Jenkins. I met Eleanor, a good, kind woman. We built a life, a respectable life, a safe life." He picked up the old photograph of RDJ again, staring at it intently. "But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I hear the music. I hear Leva's voice. And I wonder, what if?" He looked at me then, his eyes pleading for understanding, perhaps even for absolution. "And that's my confession, Sarah, that the man you know, the quiet neighbor, is a ghost of who he might have been. That I carry this silence where music used to be." The confession hung in the air between us, raw and poignant. It wasn't a scandalous secret, no illicit affair or hidden crime. It was something far more personal, far more relatable, and in its own way, far more devastating. It was the confession of a dream forsaken, a path deliberately, if painfully, abandoned. And the torn he spoke of, the tearing was within him, a lifelong internal conflict between the man he was and the man he almost was. I didn't know what to say. The sheer weight of his long-held regret, the quiet sorrow that had evidently shadowed his entire adult life, was overwhelming. He had carried this burden alone for so many years. Why he chose to share it with me, now, I wasn't sure, but I felt an immense wave of empathy for him. This wasn't just Arthur, the slightly fussy retired professor. This was Arthur, the man who had loved and lost, who had dreamed and despaired. "Arthur," I finally managed, my voice gentle. That's a lot to carry." He nodded, a single weary movement. "It is. And I suppose I've just grown tired of carrying it alone. Maybe it's the age, you know. You start looking back more than forward. And the what-ifs get louder." He gestured vaguely towards the stars. "Nights like this, so quiet and vast, they make you think." The silence that fell then was different from before. It was softer, imbued with a shared understanding. The air, still fragrant with honeysuckle, seemed to embrace us. I thought about my own what-ifs, the smaller, less dramatic ones, but what-ifs nonetheless. We all had them, as he said. But his felt monumental, a fundamental rerouting of a life's trajectory. "Why me, Arthur?" I asked softly after a while. "Why tell me this now?" He turned his gaze from the photograph to my face, a faint, almost wistful smile playing on his lips. "Because, Sarah," he said, his voice regaining a touch of its familiar warmth, "you listen. I've seen you in your garden, tending to your plants with such care. I've seen you with your books. There's a quiet strength about you, a stillness. I suppose I felt you wouldn't judge, that you might understand." His words touched me. It was true, I was a listener by nature and by profession. People often confided in me, perhaps sensing that same stillness he spoke of. But this was different. This felt like being entrusted with a fragile piece of his soul. And he continued, a little shyly, "I've been meaning to ask you something else, something related in a way. But I needed you to know this first. To know who I really am, or who I almost was." My heart gave a little flutter. Something else. What more could there be after a revelation like that? The night, it seemed, was far from over. The cicadas sang on, their chorus a soundtrack to this unexpected unburdening. I looked at Arthur, his face now more open, more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. The stars above us seemed to lean in, as if they too were eager to hear what would come next. He had shared his past, a past that left him feeling torn, incomplete. And now he was hinting at a future, or at least a present, that might somehow involve me. The thought was both daunting and, in a strange way, exhilarating. The ordinary had indeed been peeled back, and the world suddenly felt a little wider, a little more full of hidden depths and surprising possibilities. Arthur picked up the harmonica again, not with reverence this time, but with a tentative curiosity, as if reacquainting himself with an old friend. He turned it over in his hands, the metal cool against his skin. "This little thing," he mused, more to himself than to me. "It holds so many ghosts." He blew a soft, breathy note, then another. It wasn't a tune, just a sound, but it was clear, mournful, and surprisingly sweet. It seemed to hang in the humid air for a moment before dissolving into the night. "I haven't played properly in—" "Oh, decades," he said, looking back at me. Eleanor, bless her, she encouraged me now and then. She found this box after we'd been married a few years, tucked away in the attic. She'd asked me to play for her sometimes. I did, a few times. Old folk songs, mostly. Nothing like the blues I used to live and breathe. My chops were gone, of course. And the heart wasn't really in it. It was like trying to rekindle a fire with damp wood. He put the harmonica down again. "But lately," he continued, his voice dropping a little, "I've been thinking. All this quiet time since I retired. Too much time to think, perhaps." He gave a small, wry chuckle. "And I found myself wondering if there was still a spark left. Not to reclaim RDJ, that ship has sailed, and I made my peace with that choice, or at least I told myself I had. But maybe just to make a little music again. for myself, for the joy of it, if there's any left to be found. I listened, fascinated. This was an Arthur I was beginning to see more clearly now, a man not just defined by his past regrets, but perhaps by a dawning desire to reconnect with a lost part of himself, however tentatively. "The thing is, Sarah," he said, leaning forward slightly, his gaze earnest, "it's a lonely business, trying to make music in a vacuum. And frankly, I'm a bit scared to even try. Scared of the silence if I fail. Scared of what it might dredge up." He paused, then took the plunge. "I was wondering, you seem to enjoy music. I hear it sometimes, drifting from your house. Classical, mostly, with sometimes a bit of jazz." I nodded. "Yes, I do. Music is a great comfort." "Well," he said, a hint of color rising in his cheeks, "I have this old record player, and a collection of blues records that haven't seen the light of day in half a century. I was thinking, perhaps, if you wouldn't mind, you could come over sometime and just listen. With me? Maybe if I had someone to share them with, it wouldn't feel so daunting. And who knows," he added, with a touch of self-deprecating humor, "I might even be persuaded to try a note or two on this old thing." He patted the harmonica. My mind raced. This was his second question, the one he'd needed to preface with his life story. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture, not in the traditional sense. It was something quieter, more vulnerable. An invitation not just into his house, but into this rediscovered corner of his heart. He wanted a companion, an audience of one, not for a performance, but for an exploration. A shared journey back to a sound he'd long silenced. The torn he felt was now making even more sense. He was torn between the safety of his quiet, established life and the faint, alluring call of a passion he thought had died. And now he was asking me to witness, perhaps even to gently encourage, this tentative step towards healing that rift. "Arthur," I said, my voice soft but clear, "I would like that very much." A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unburdened smile that seemed to lift years from his features. It was as if a weight I hadn't even realized he was carrying had just been set down, at least for a moment. "You would?" he asked, almost like a boy who'd just been told yes to a longed-for treat. "Yes," I affirmed. "I can't think of anything I'd enjoy more. To listen to those old records, and perhaps," I added, gesturing towards the harmonica, "to hear a little of RDJ after all these years." His smile widened. "Don't expect too much on that front," he chuckled. "RDJ is an old rusty ghost." "Sometimes ghosts have the most interesting stories to tell," I replied. We sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the understanding between us settling like a warm blanket. The confession, the vulnerability, his unexpected invitation, it had changed the landscape of our quiet, neighborly existence. It felt like the beginning of something new, something tentative and precious. A friendship, perhaps, deepened by shared secrets and the quiet understanding of lives lived with their share of joys and regrets. He carefully closed the lid of the wooden box, the click of the clasp sounding very final in the stillness. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice sincere. "For listening, for for just being you." "Thank you for sharing, Arthur," I replied. "It means a great deal to me that you felt you could." He picked up the box. "Perhaps Friday evening, around 7, I could make us some coffee. Or I still have some of that lemonade you said you liked from the church picnic." "Lemonade sounds lovely," I said. "Friday at 7 it is." He stood up, looking less stooped, less burdened than when he had arrived. Well, I should let you get back to your evening. He paused at the edge of the patio. Sarah, he said, turning back, this has been good. Yes, Arthur, I agreed. It has. He gave me a small nod, a genuine smile still lingering in his eyes, and then he walked back towards his own house, the box held carefully in his hands. I watched him go, my mind still reeling slightly from everything he'd shared. My quiet, predictable neighbor, RDJ, the bluesman, the man torn by a choice made half a lifetime ago. I sat there for a long time after he'd gone inside, the iced tea in my glass now mostly melted water. The stars still blazed overhead. They seemed different now, imbued with the stories and secrets of the night. I thought about the courage it took for Arthur to unearth such a deeply buried part of himself, to share his vulnerability with me. It was a gift in its own way, a gift of trust. And I felt a shift within myself too. My own quiet life, which had sometimes felt a little too predictable, a little too beige, suddenly seemed to contain a new possibility for connection, for understanding. Arthur's confession hadn't just been about his past. It had, in an unexpected way, opened a door in my present. I wasn't torn like he had been, not in that profound, life-altering way. But his story had reminded me that everyone carries hidden depths, unspoken histories. It made me want to listen more carefully, to look beyond the surface. The idea of Friday evening, listening to old blues records with Arthur, perhaps even hearing him coax a few notes from that harmonica, filled me with a gentle anticipation. It wasn't a date, not in the romantic sense. It felt more like an exploration, a chance to connect with another human being on a level that went beyond polite pleasantries and shared fence lines. I finally went inside, the scent of honeysuckle following me. My little house felt the same, but I felt different. As I got ready for bed, I found myself humming a nameless tune, a bluesy little melody I hadn't realized I knew. Arthur's story had stirred something in me, a reminder of the music that lies dormant in all of us, waiting for the right moment, or perhaps the right person, to coax it out. And as I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the unexpected turns life can take, even in the quietest of neighborhoods, under the silent watch of the summer stars. The feeling of being torn that Arthur had described resonated with me, not in its specifics, but in the universal sense of paths taken and not taken, of dreams cherished and sometimes, necessarily, let go. His confession had indeed left me reflecting, not just on his life, but on my own and on the quiet courage it takes to share one's truest, most vulnerable self. And what happened next? Well, that Friday evening was just the beginning. Friday arrived with a soft, hazy kind of sunshine, the kind that promises a warm evening without the oppressive humidity of earlier in the week. I found myself looking forward to 7 o'clock with an eagerness that surprised me. It wasn't just about hearing old records. It was about Arthur. The Arthur I was just getting to know, the one who had carried a silent song within him for so long. I chose a simple cotton dress, something comfortable. I didn't want to make it seem like anything more than it was, a neighborly visit, albeit one with a little more emotional depth than usual. As I walked across the lawn that separated our houses, I noticed the small things. The way Arthur's roses seemed to be particularly vibrant, the neatness of his porch, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of lemon polish. He opened the door before I even knocked, a welcoming smile on his face. He was wearing a freshly pressed, short-sleeved plaid shirt and looked younger, more relaxed. "Sarah, come in, he said, his voice warm. His living room was just as I'd imagined it from glimpses through the window over the years. Tidy, comfortable, filled with books and a few well-chosen pieces of antique furniture. It spoke of a life of quiet contemplation, but now, knowing his story, I saw it differently. I wondered if the quietness had sometimes felt oppressive to him, a constant reminder of the vibrant noise of his past. The old record player, a handsome wooden console model, sat in a place of honor by the window. A stack of LPs, their covers faded and worn, was beside it. And on a small table, next to 2 tall glasses of lemonade and a plate of what looked like homemade cookies, was the wooden box. Its lid was closed. "Please have a seat," Arthur said, gesturing to a comfortable armchair. "I made oatmeal raisin cookies. Eleanor's recipe. They were always her specialty." "They smell wonderful, Arthur," I said, settling into the chair. The room had a pleasant, lived-in feel. Photos on the mantelpiece showed a smiling Eleanor, Arthur looking more like the professor I knew, and various scenic shots, likely from their travels. There was no photo of RDJ here. That part of his life remained confined to the box. He poured the lemonade, the ice clinking merrily. "So," he began, handing me a glass, "where should we start? I have quite a collection. Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Lightnin' Hopkins. A lot of the Chicago blues guys. And some of the older Delta blues, too. Why don't you choose the first one?" I suggested. "Something that means a lot to you." He thought for a moment, then carefully selected an album. "This one, then," he said, holding it up. The cover showed a black and white photo of a man with a guitar, his face deeply lined, his eyes looking out with a soulful intensity. Robert Johnson. They say he sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads to play like he did. Arthur smiled faintly. A bit dramatic, perhaps, but his music, it has a raw power. It's where it all started for so many of us. He placed the record on the turntable with practiced ease, the needle hissing slightly as it found the groove. And then the music began. A lone guitar, spare and haunting, followed by a voice that seemed to carry all the sorrow and longing of the world. It wasn't music I was very familiar with, but it was undeniably powerful. It filled the quiet room, weaving a spell that was both melancholic and strangely uplifting. Arthur leaned back in his own chair, his eyes closed, listening intently. I watched him, seeing the subtle shifts in his expression as the music played, a flicker of memory, a shadow of sadness, a hint of a smile. It was clear that these songs were not just entertainment for him. They were a part of his soul, a language he understood intimately. We listened to the entire side of the album in comfortable silence, punctuated only by the clinking of ice in our glasses and the occasional soft sigh from Arthur. When it finished, the silence that returned felt different, enriched by the music that had just been there. "Powerful stuff, isn't it?" he said softly, opening his eyes. "It truly is," I replied. "So much emotion in every note." "That's the blues for you," he said, "turning pain into something beautiful, or at least something shared." He got up and flipped the record. "This next track, this was one Layla and I used to try and emulate. Her voice could soar over these mournful chords like an angel." He spoke her name with a tenderness that was deeply moving. There was no bitterness, only a gentle wistfulness. As the music started again, he began to talk, not about his past with Leela, but about the music itself, explaining the nuances, the history of the artists, the way a certain guitar lick or harmonica phrase made him feel. He was Professor Jenkins again, but this time his subject was not ancient history, but the history of his heart expressed through these old songs. I listened, captivated. He had a way of making it all come alive, his passion for the music evident in every word. It was clear that this was a part of himself he had longed to share. The cookies were delicious, The lemonade was tart and refreshing, but the real nourishment was in the conversation, in the shared experience of the music. After a while, as the second record played, a more upbeat, electric Chicago blues compilation, he seemed to gather his courage. He glanced at the wooden box. "You know," he said, a little hesitantly, "I did get the old harmonicas out this week. Cleaned them up a bit." My heart gave a little leap of anticipation. "Oh, yes, just noodling around, trying to see if my fingers and my lungs still remembered anything." He gave a self-deprecating laugh. It was mostly squeaks and air, to be honest. "I'm sure it wasn't that bad," I encouraged gently. He looked at the box again, then at me. "There's one song, a simple one, something I used to play to warm up. Would you mind if I tried? It'll probably be terrible." "Arthur," I said, my voice warm, "I would be honored to hear you play." He took a deep breath, then reached for the box and opened it. He selected the gleaming chromatic harmonica, the one I'd seen the other night. He held it for a moment, then lifted it to his lips. He closed his eyes. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then he breathed out a single, long, clear note. It hung in the air, surprisingly strong and pure. He followed it with another, then another, slowly forming a simple, mournful melody. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't the performance of a young man on a stage, but it was Arthur. It was RDJ, stirring from his long sleep. His fingers moved with a remembered grace, his cheeks puffing slightly, his body swaying almost imperceptibly to the rhythm he was creating. The tune was melancholic, yes, but there was a sweetness to it as well, a kind of gentle yearning. It was a far cry from squeaks and air. It was music, real music. When he finished, he slowly lowered the harmonica, a look of surprise, and perhaps a little pride, on his face. The room was silent for a moment, the last note seeming to echo in the stillness. "Well," he said, a little breathlessly, "that wasn't quite as disastrous as I expected." "Arthur," I said, my voice filled with genuine admiration, "that was beautiful. Truly beautiful." A wide, almost boyish grin spread across his face. "You think so?" "I know so," I said. "It was like hearing a story only you could tell." He seemed to ponder that for a moment. "Perhaps you're right," he said softly. "Perhaps there are still a few notes left in me after all." He looked at the harmonica in his hand, then back at me, his eyes shining. "Thank you, Sarah, for being here, for listening. It made all the difference." That evening marked a change. Not a dramatic, earth-shattering change, but a subtle shift in the rhythm of our lives. We started having regular music nights, sometimes at his house, sometimes at mine. He'd play his old records, and I'd share some of my jazz collection, which he found he quite enjoyed. And slowly, tentatively, he started playing his harmonica more. Sometimes just a few notes, sometimes a whole song. He even started trying to learn new tunes, his brow furrowed in concentration as he practiced. It wasn't about reclaiming a lost youth or resurrecting RDJ from the ashes of the past. It was about finding a way to integrate that part of himself into the man he was now. It was about giving voice to the music that had never truly died, just been silenced for a too long time. And for me, I found a depth of friendship I hadn't expected. Arthur, with his quiet wisdom, his newfound musical expression, and his endearing vulnerability, became a cherished companion. Our conversations ranged far and wide, from books and history to gardening and the simple absurdities of life. We respected each other's solitude, but the shared moments became increasingly precious. His confession under the stars hadn't just revealed his past. It had unlocked a future for both of us, a future filled with a richer, deeper connection. It taught me that sometimes the most profound discoveries are made in the quietest of places, between the most unassuming of people. It showed me that being torn isn't always a prelude to breaking, but sometimes it's the prelude to a mending, a coming together of disparate parts to form a more complete, more authentic whole. The cicadas still sang their nightly symphony, the honeysuckle still perfumed the air. But now there was often another sound drifting between our houses, the sweet, soulful melody of a harmonica, played not with the brash confidence of youth, but with the quiet, heartfelt wisdom of a life that had known both silence and song. And I, his friend, his neighbor, was privileged to be there to listen, to share in the music, and to witness the gentle, courageous blooming of a spirit that had decided it was never too late to play again. And that, I think you'll agree, was something quite wonderful indeed.